In reality, within the criminal history of Austria, there was a notable case involving a serial killer who harbored delusions of manipulating public opinion through the media. This serial killer was known as Jack. Psychological evaluations diagnosed him with sadistic psychosis, accompanied by narcissistic and histrionic tendencies, as well as prone to agitation and anger. While incarcerated in a dark cell, he garnered public and literary attention through his literary talents, evoking sympathy. Following his release from prison, he skillfully employed his charm and public persona to conceal his enduring violent inclinations. The most disturbing aspect was that, as a criminal journalist, Jack interviewed the police and reported to the public on the investigations and details of the murder cases. No one knew that it was he who committed these murders. Jack, a paradoxical combination of guilt and talent, is a story full of darkness and irony. 42 years ago, an autobiography entitled Purgatory or The Journey to Jail was published in the Austrian press. This book was written by Jack, who also wrote some fairy tales and poems. In this book, Jack shows in vivid words how he was marginalized by society when he was growing up, and how he gradually fell into the abyss of crime in the absence of proper guidance. He describes the terrible environment in the prison, the smallness and simplicity of the cells, the outdated facilities inside the cells, how those inmates helped or cheated each other in the prison. He also delves into how he transformed himself from a cold-blooded killer to a man who loves life, including his psychological transformation process and the formation and evolution of his criminal mind. As a result, the book generated a certain degree of discussion in Europe and other countries upon its release, especially attracting the attention of the literary elites in Germany and Austria, since Jack was Austrian and his first victim was from Germany. For example, Elfriede, the winner of the 2004 Nobel Prize for Literature, praised the autobiography for its clarity and outstanding literary quality. Austrian historian and talk show host Peter found the book to be authentically written, with genuine weeping and confessions. The editor of the publishing house also visited Jack in prison, where he told the people that Jack was a gentle and talented man and that they must pardon him. It is well known that there are those who believe that even those who commit serious crimes have goodness in them and the possibility of reform, who long to see the goodness of human nature triumph over evil and depravity, and Jack's actions seem to confirm them. Imagine a cold-blooded killer who, because of the remorse in his heart, even though he stayed in a prison in a very poor environment, and even though he was an illiterate man, was able to become a literary creator through continuous learning and touch the hearts of many people with his heartfelt and evocative words. That's why Jack supporters see this autobiography as evidence that Jack has been rehabilitated. Born on August 16, 1950, in Judenburg, Styria, Austria, Jack undoubtedly had a childhood and adolescence marred by violence and neglect. Jack's mother, Teresa, was a repeat offender with multiple convictions for minor crimes such as fraud, forgery, and embezzlement. She was even in prison while pregnant with Jack. Later, Jack revealed in his book that Teresa had engaged in prostitution on multiple occasions, which deepened his hatred towards her. And Teresa claimed that Jack was lying and fabricating everything to boost the sales of his book. Jack's father was an American soldier stationed in Italy who had only a brief relationship with Teresa. He played no role in Jack's life and may not have even known of Jack's existence. When Jack was 1 year old, his mother Teresa was arrested by the police for a previous fraud offense. Jack, who had already been deprived of parental care, was sent to live in a foster home. A year later, Jack was taken in by his grandfather, with whom he lived for the next 6 years. Later, Jack described his grandfather as a violent alcoholic, who not only frequently had Jack help him steal animals from the farm, but also brought strange women home and forced young Jack to watch them have sex. However, Jack's claims were contradicted by different evidence, such as government records, testimonies from neighbors and relatives, and some pointed out that Jack's grandfather, who hardly left the house due to his perennial poor health, partial facial paralysis, and near deafness in his left ear. When Jack was 8 years old, his grandfather, weakened by old age, reached a point where he needed to be taken care of by others and could no longer take care of Jack. So Jack began to move between various foster homes. It is well known that if a child does not receive parental care during his early years, he will develop serious psychological problems. By the age of 16, Jack had already been arrested 16 times for crimes such as theft, burglary, pimping, and assaulting prostitutes. Between 1966 and 1974, Jack spent most of his time in prison. In 1974, Jack found a girlfriend called Barbara. The couple's relationship was not normal. Their relationship was more like master and sex slave. For example, Barbara would work with several other girls to support Jack through prostitution. On December 11th, 24-year-old Jack committed the first murder of his life, which was against Barbara's friend, an 18-year-old German girl named Margaret. That night, Jack, who was penniless, he took Barbara with him to prepare for burglaries. At first, Barbara took Jack with her to steal the money that her parents had kept in the house. However, a girl happened to be passing by and noticed their theft. So, in order to keep from going to jail, Barbara and Jack wanted to catch the girl and intimidate her to prevent her from reporting it to the police. When the girl walked under the streetlight, Barbara recognized her as her friend Margaret. She warmly invited Margaret to get into the car. However, once in the car, Jack struck Margaret's face and tied her hands behind her back. He also stole her wallet. Margaret, in a state of panic, kept crying for help and pleaded with Jack and Barbara to let her go. Hearing this, Jack promised to release her in the countryside. But after driving to the edge of woods, he forced Margaret out of the car and made her follow him into the woods. Upon entering the woods, Jack said that he would let her go if she agreed to have sex with him. However, Margaret refused. Enraged by her refusal, Jack grabbed an iron rod and struck Margaret fiercely. She fell to the ground in agony, continuing to beg for mercy, but Jack did not stop. He first tied Margaret up with a pair of tights and then used the iron rod to brutally humiliate her, eventually strangling the girl to death. Finally, he tied her bra around her neck and covered her body with dirt and leaves. During the trial, Jack claimed that he killed Margaret because of the effects of psychotropic drugs. He said that when he beat Margaret with an iron bar, he saw his mother's reflection in her eyes and became so enraged that he waited until he gradually came to his senses, only to find the girl dead. In order to mislead the judge and jurors, he completely omits his burglary and sexual humiliation of Margaret, claiming only that his crime was the result of childhood trauma. But Barbara confessed everything, such as how they burglarized the house and how they met Margaret, including the fact that, at the end, she saw Jack and Margaret go into the woods, and 10 minutes later, Jack returned alone, holding an iron bar covered in blood and hair. Jack was sentenced to life in prison for this murder, and Barbara was sentenced to 8 years as an accomplice. In 1985, a protest for the forced pardon of Jack was initiated by dozens of intellectuals and government officials. Shockingly, one of the supporters' statements even claimed that Austrian justice would be measured by the Jack case. However, no one paid attention to some disturbing signs indicating that Jack had not completely rid himself of his obsession with murder and violence. Jack wrote, "There's no more poetic theme than the death of a beautiful woman." In another poem, he wrote, "You still look strange and distant, vibrant, death, but one day you will come close, full of flames. Come, lover, I am there, take me, I am yours." The protest was ultimately rejected by the Austrian president on the grounds that the court-mandated minimum 15-year imprisonment had not been served. Nevertheless, Jack had already realized the power of controlling public opinion. 3 years later, in order to gain more attention, he republished his book. Additionally, a renowned Austrian film director adapted his book into a movie titled Jack the Writer, as a mockery of the historical Jack the Ripper. Newspapers, media, and the literary world were all discussing Jack. By this time, the majority of the public, as well as intellectuals and public figures, had begun to speak out in support of Jack. On May 23, 1990, Jack was released from prison. The then prison warden claimed that, "We would never find a prisoner so well prepared for freedom." However, it turned out that Jack was prepared for freedom, and his supporters were prepared. But the victims were not prepared for the harm they should not have suffered. After his release from prison, Jack virtually became a celebrity who could represent Austria. The book Purgatory was regarded as a masterpiece by schools, and radio stations broadcast children's stories written by Jack. Moreover, leveraging his newfound fame, Jack continuously held lecture events. On a popular talk show of the Austrian Broadcasting Corporation, Jack, dressed in a distinctive white silk suit with a red carnation on his lapel and a gold chain around his wrist, discussed reducing the stigma surrounding individuals with criminal histories with the host, his fingers adorned with gold rings constantly gesturing. And also, Jack became a journalist specializing in crime reporting and hosted a television program discussing criminal rehabilitation. In October 1990, a sex worker was found dead, her death mirroring that of Margaret, with her bra tied around her neck. In the following months, 7 more women were murdered, each a sex worker, and each killed in the same manner, strangled with a bra and then buried in the woods. As more women continued to disappear from Vienna's red light district, Jack, as a crime journalist, was assigned to a popular evening radio program to report on these very murders that he had committed. During an interview with Jack, a senior police officer said, "Unfortunately, it hasn't been solved. Despite extensive investigations, we haven't made any breakthroughs so far." Another officer added, "In Vienna, we don't have experience dealing with a serial killer, so we don't know what his motives are." In the summer of 1991, Jack traveled to Los Angeles on a reporting assignment for the Austrian Broadcasting Corporation. Tasked with exploring the dark underbelly of the city known as the City of Angels, he needed to understand the dangers of the streets and interview sex workers. During a street interview, one sex worker said, "It's ugly, it's dirty, and it's terrifying. Every time you get in a car, you might die. Every time you drive away, you don't know if he's going to kill you." On June 20th, Shannon was discovered as the first deceased female, followed by Irina and Peggy. Similar to the murders in Vienna, all three victims were strangled with their brass. During the investigation, a criminal profiler stated, "This unique behavior allows us to reasonably conclude that we are looking for a serial killer. All three victims were killed by the same perpetrator." Although Jack seemed to be in the limelight at this time and most people believed he had been redeemed, not everyone was convinced that Jack could truly reform. A crime journalist who was investigating two murders in Graz noted that, like the victims in Vienna, both victims there had also been strangled with their brass. Because the modus operandi of these serial murders closely matched the way Jack's victims had been killed, the journalist became suspicious of Jack. He said, "For me, there's a single thread connecting all the crime scenes. I am convinced that we are on the right track, so I informed the Graz police." At first, in order to find clues about the suspect, the Graz police found 3 sex workers living in the red light district. They showed 3 sex workers a photo of Jack and asked if they had seen this man. All 3 of them answered yes. A sex worker also told a disturbing story. She said that on that evening, a man in a white suit driving a white Ford Mustang entered the red light district. Then he found her and said he was a journalist who wanted to learn about the real lives of sex workers in the red light district. However, he took her to a forest and forcibly handcuffed her. Just as the woman was imagining her own death, the man unlocked her handcuffs and drove her back to the red light district. A police officer commented that the story matched their assumed modus operandi and the identity of the murderer in every aspect, except that she wasn't killed. Just as Jack returned to Austria, the police forces of the United States and Austria also got in touch. They talked about the similar murder cases that occurred in both countries from beginning to end. And since Jack left Austria, no new murder cases had emerged there. Moreover, with his arrival, sex workers in Los Angeles began to die. So Jack was identified as the sole suspect by the police of both countries. Eventually, the Graz police gathered sufficient evidence to arrest Jack, but when they entered his home with the arrest warrant, Jack had already fled. During his escape, Jack still kept trying to manipulate public opinion through the media, continuing to describe fabricated details, including that his motive for the murder was rooted in childhood trauma rather than sexual motives, in order to convince the ignorant that he was innocent. On February 27, 1992, Jack was arrested in Miami, Florida. Jack was arrested because of his passion for public opinion. That day, the police tricked him into believing they were reporters from a magazine. They promised to pay him $10,000 and let him share his story with the public. However, when Jack dressed up and entered the interview room, the people waiting for him were not reporters but police officers. On May 27th, Jack was extradited back to Austria, where he was charged with 11 murders. On June 29, 1994, Jack was sentenced to life in prison without parole. On the night of his conviction, Jack hanged himself by tying a thin cord from his sweatpants around his neck. "I can't stand being back in a cell," Jack had said after his arrest. Then, he kept his word and chose to die. An Austrian politician commented, "It was Jack's best murder." Later, it seemed that Jack's fans, who had been obsessed with him, finally had a wake-up call. For example, Peter, who had still supported Jack even after he was convicted of 9 murders, said, "At the time, I truly believed that Jack was a reformed person, but now I feel that I was cheated and that I need to take some responsibility."